Chapter 9. My Aching Arms. Trauma is not just a story or an experience, but it is physical changes that happen in the brain. Dr. Bezel van der Kolk. My arms just ache. When will this feeling leave me? I keep telling my mind that there is no baby to pick up or hold, but equally I'm longing to hold her again. For now, the numbness has lifted and new emotions of anger and sadness have entered my mind and body. I feel tortured when I watch the news and hear of babies and children neglected or hurt by their parents. It just isn't right. I would just give anything, just anything, to have Emma back in my arms. I have all this love to give, but no one to give it to. I was desperately trying to reconcile while I felt so empty and alone. Then I finally figured it out. It was the first time that I felt love, actually felt love, and could give love. It was a completely new emotion for me. I felt alive. Emma had awakened something within me. You see, for me, growing up in a very strict religious household, love meant discipline, but it was harsh discipline. Affection or praise was rarely displayed. It was always punishment first, then ask questions later. Saying no or talking back, even when I was trying to explain that I didn't do it, it wasn't me, resulted in a harder or even more severe punishment. It was not allowed. It was classed as being defiant, disrespectful, or disobedient. The world was seen as good or bad, or black and white. It was right or it was wrong. There was no in between, no grey areas, no tolerance for any other views or mistakes. It was a rigid way to live. I was constantly on high alert, waiting to be scolded or smacked for the next thing I did wrong. I was a child trying to learn and grow. Of course, I was going to make mistakes. I had trouble reconciling how this type of parenting reflected the example of Jesus that we were constantly reminded to imitate. Everything I knew and read about Jesus was that he was kind, tolerant, patient, and understanding. This was not what I experienced. For me, it was like walking on eggshells most of the time. I was told to obey any authority, teachers, police officers, elders, any adult, because they are an adult. So I grew up thinking that I didn't matter, my needs didn't matter. I didn't know what it even meant to have boundaries or to be able to say no without feeling guilty. That is why I felt so uncomfortable questioning the nurse about Emma's spots. The voice inside my head was saying, "Who do you think you are to question someone in this position?" It was acceptable practice back then for any adult to strap, belt, slap, pinch, or use reasonable force on a child that left you with welts, bruises, or marks. Research over the past 50 years has shown that this type of punishment, although well intended, has had a huge physical and psychological effect on many adults, including myself. It was not right. It was abuse. The consequences for a lot of adults is that many of us look like adults, talk like adults, yet behave and act like a grown, wounded child. Children, therapists and doctors would now call it cruel and abusive, abuse that kills the soul of the child. Many parents, and my parents, just weren't emotionally available. They were tuned into us physically, but not emotionally. They didn't get their needs, emotional needs, met by their parents. Most parents of this era were emotionally retarded. For example, how many times were you told to stop your crying or I'll give you something to cry about? Or don't you raise your voice at me? When these words are constantly repeated, it wears you down and makes you feel ashamed and worthless for who you are. Dr. Bruce Perry, a renowned brain development and trauma expert, discusses this in his book, What Happened to You? And I quote, "A cold, disengaged, partially attentive caregiver can have immediate and potentially lifelong toxic effects on the developing child. This child may grow up feeling inadequate and unlovable. Even with many gifts and skills, they will feel that they are not enough as an adult and that can lead to a host of maladaptive behaviours, including unhealthy forms of attention-seeking, self-sabotage, or even self-destructive behaviour. End of quote. Most of this type of parenting style was an era of patriarchal parenting that many parents implemented. It was modelled off their own parents, then adapted to what they wanted to implement or dump. John Bradshaw explains what this parenting style in his book Homecoming says. Patriarchy is characterised by male dominance, but it doesn't mean that only men do it. Women raised by a patriarch can become a patriarch. It is based on blind obedience, obedience without context. You do it because I said so. A lot of parents acted shameless by acting like they know it all. It is based on the repression of all emotions except fear. It is based on the crushing of the will at any age, especially an early age. That is, you obey me. I crave love, and the only way that I felt I could be loved was by thinking and doing what my parents required me as a child. My purpose and identity in life was to take care of others and make sure that they were okay before anything else. It was classed as being selfish to ask for anything. To feel any sense of self-worth, others' needs always came before your own. To be a people pleaser at all costs. I unconsciously developed a false self or a mask because in that way I found a way to matter. In her book, The Ultimate You, Sharon, now known as Remy Pearson, describes this false self in detail. It is what we do as a child to survive, because who else would look after us? We do what we do to survive. I just learnt to shut down, be compliant, or numb out. The best statement I heard describing what I felt was by Joel Colbert in John Bradshaw's book Creating Love. Quote, I was most lovable when I was not being me. End of quote. Many religious preachers teach that the highest form of love is self-sacrifice, to set aside one's own physical, emotional, and intellectual needs to serve and take care of others. They teach long-suffering and martyrdom as two of the major ways to attain goodness. Acting good, acting righteous were more important than actually being good. Acting loving was more important than being loving. For many years, I believed that was how every Christian person behaved, and that this was the right way to be, to get approval or to get love. This is wrong. The Bible even says that we need to take care of ourselves. My parents were children of the war, and sometimes they experienced a lack of food, clothing, or the absence of coal to heat the house. So it was no wonder they became angry when we spilt the milk or broke a plate when we were drying the dishes. Thing is, as a child, I never set out to do this intentionally, but you were punished as if you did. It is tough being a parent, and I understand that they were parenting us the best way they knew how. They also had their own emotional struggles to deal with that I wasn't aware of until my mid-20s. My dad's mum lived in Scotland 12,000 miles away and suffered from severe mental illness and depression. He would get homesick, and on top of that, my parents were always watching their pennies. Dad had many responsibilities as an elder in our congregation. This position meant there was a lot of pressure to be an exemplary example, which required that his children be a fine example. To achieve this result, he needed us to be kept on the straight and narrow, which required severe discipline. There was no reasoning or a loving explanation about what you did or didn't do wrong. I used to think that God must think I was a very bad person to get those wallops, those smacks, those scalps, or whatever you want to call it. I now know through my studies that a person can't give what they don't have. Let me say that again. A person can't give what they don't have. Dad didn't have a mother who was emotionally present because of her illness. So in his mind, he thought he was being a good parent. It wasn't right, but it was an explanation of why I was raised the way I was. I see them through a different lens now. They weren't bad people. Their behaviour was bad. What I am grateful for is the time my mum gave me to teach me the skills of how to be a capable wife. My mum was a great cook, dressmaker, knitter and homemaker. She spent every season preparing jams, pickles and preserves from the garden. She shared all these wonderful skills with me. It was reassuring to know that I was good at something. However, I really struggled emotionally as a teenager. By the time I was 14 years old, my home life became stricter and it was hard to reason with my dad. So when the first boy that came along when I was 17 years old and told me that he loved me, I thought that was the most wonderful thing in the world because I thought I was unlovable. I loved him for being able to love me. I know that sounds really messed up, but it makes sense when Dr. Bruce Perry in his book, What Happened to You, explains this. He said, and I quote, "Dismissive caregiving can lead to an unquenchable thirst for love. You cannot love if you have not been loved." But there was another problem to contend with. Neil wasn't of the same faith as me, and that was a big no-no in our family. So I was given the ultimatum to stop seeing him or move out of home. That was the rules. I was so desperately unhappy, I chose the latter. I was done, physically, mentally, and emotionally. I just remember saying to myself, I surrender. I've had enough. I just don't want to feel like this any longer. Just very sad and empty, but equally I felt so low and numb, like a child who had been abandoned by her parents, the very ones that were supposed to protect you and love you. So, between 17 and 25 years of age, I only saw my parents about 4 times. It was only due to being admitted to the hospital to have Emma that we were reconnected. So, when she died, I felt like my whole world had fallen apart. At 25 years of age, it was very hard to envisage how the future was supposed to look brighter and get better. There were some pretty dark days, and yes, suicide crossed my mind, but I was aware enough that to know I would just be transmitting my wounds and pain onto my parents and my friends. The reality was I didn't want to die, I just wanted the physical and mental pain to stop.